I'm a child of Metroland. My first address was in North Harrow. My second was in Pinner, where I spent most of my teenage years. And so I've always been intrigued by the Metropolitan line, but at the same time, I was forced as a teenager to watch the interminable and highly romanticized John Betjeman documentary on Metroland. It struck me that he didn't really actually understand what he was talking about. He didn't actually live in Metroland. I did. And so I thought I'd take you on a tour of Metroland. Let's begin at the beginning. The Metropolitan Railway started from Paddington to Farringdon in 1863, making it the oldest urban railway of its type in the world. Metroland really is the offshoot of that line that goes north from Baker Street. Baker Street itself is the name of a road, not a neighbourhood, and it's just around the corner from the very first Lord's cricket ground. But that ground had long since gone by the time Baker Street Station came into existence in the 1860s. Lord's had moved to the other end of Regent's Park, in the edge of St John's Wood. As we move northwards out of central London, we come into real Metroland. Finchley Road Station has a number of the classic features. First of all, it's a junction as much as anything else. If you go up the hill from Finchley Road, you come out of the station, cross the road, and continue onwards in that direction, you come to Hampstead Village. Very chic, but very definitely a place that belongs to the Northern Line, not the Metropolitan Line. It has a string of relatively private schools and fashionable residences. It's been a cool neighbourhood basically since the early 18th century and possibly beyond. Finchley Road Station is actually technically in the neighbourhood known as Swiss Cottage, after the Swiss Cottage pub, which dates from the middle of the 19th century and therefore preceded the construction of the Swiss Cottage station, the next stop up, going southwards along the Jubilee line from Finchley Road. If you point from Finchley Road in the opposite direction, you end up in South Hampstead and ultimately Kilburn and West Hampstead, areas of a much more mixed population in every sense, and in some cases genuinely poverty-stricken, in others full of interesting immigrant character. Kilburn with its Irish community initially, now a more general ethnic minority community. West Hampstead with its long tradition alongside Swiss Cottage of welcoming refugees from Europe. Some of these traditions are fading with time, but there they are. Between Finchley Road and the next stop on the line, Wembley Park, are a string of Jubilee line stops. The penultimate one is the one that John Betjeman fastened on, Neasden, in the early 1970s. When he was making the documentary in question, there were lots of funny jokes about Neasden, but no one's laughing about it nowadays because it has the magnificent Hindu temple, which is very well worth a visit. It's also the Neasden depot, for which Neasden is famous, and that's where trains go to sleep at night, I think. But as we get into Wembley Park, we come across two stadia. The one everyone knows about, Wembley Stadium, rebuilt version of the stadium that existed from the 1920s, and the product or the cause of chants about going to Wembley. People, football fans who sing that stuff don't realize how accurate they're being. It is the original name of the neighborhood. Lee is the Anglo-Saxon word for a meadow. Next door, nearby the stadium, is the Empire Pool. Well, that's what it was originally called. It was created in time for the Empire Games of 1934 and is now known as the Wembley Arena. It holds 12,500 people, and it's where I went to my first ever pop concert. Not a great venue for that because you can't see the stage. There are so many people involved. It was a sporting venue into the early part of the millennium, actually. Tennis, more particularly show jumping featuring there. Don't think it's been used as a swimming pool since the 1948 Olympics. As we move a little bit further north, we find two stations of classic Metroland vintage, Preston Road and Northwick Park. Both are made-up neighbourhoods. In fact, they really represent, respectively, North and South Kenton. Or is it the other way around? I think it's the other way around, actually. So Preston Road is South Kenton, Northwick Park is North Kenton. Now, the thing about these neighbourhoods is that they have parallel lines running on the Bakerloo line, parallel stations that are fairly close to them. So Northwick Park is very close indeed to North Kenton Station. And this reflects a feature of Metroland. The Metropolitan line was built through the slightly posher neighbourhoods. The more working class neighbourhoods were the venue for the Bakerloo line, what is now the Bakerloo line, and there's also the Euston to Glasgow line that runs alongside it or runs as part of it. It tend to be the slightly less chic neighbourhoods. So you get Headstone Lane being near but not in North Harrow, and Hatch End being the slightly poorer relation of the rather posh Pinner. Harrow on the Hill is a station with the wrong name, at least if you come out of it in one direction. If you leave the station on the city centre side, you come into a shopping centre and a pretty flat piece of real estate. It's only if you come out of the station on the hillside that the on the hill makes sense. The station isn't actually on the hill at all, to the bottom of the hill. You have to climb up it to get to Harrow School, famously where Winston Churchill was a pupil, and many others before and since. And Harrow Hill is a village of its own, but it's actually not that close to Harrow on the Hill station, and it's a decent walk up the slope. The town centre part of Harrow has always been a bit of a disappointment. In my childhood, there was a lot of development work made there, and a lot of hopes that it would become a sort of chic shopping centre, business area, that I don't think have ever really taken off. I may be wrong about that. Harrow, though, definitely has seniority on its CV. Its original name, Herger, does appear in the Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's account, compiled under his instruction, not by him personally, of his domain. As we go beyond that, up towards North Harrow and Pinner, well, Pinner claims to be older than that. You hear allegations that it goes back to the 9th century. I'm not so sure. North Harrow was my very first address, another classic piece of Metroland built entirely because of the railway, entirely because of the attractions of a 20-25 minute commute into central London. It doesn't really have an indigenous nature to it at all, although it does have the River Yedding gently passing through it. Pinner is the much older, more established location, leaving aside the suggestion that because its original name was probably Pinora, which suggests an old Anglo-Saxon identity, the real Pinner dates from the 13th century. The medieval church in the High Street, well, it's medieval on the outside, not much on the inside, is a symbol of that. Pinner Fair, featured in Metroland, featured very briefly in the film about Elton John, Rocket Man, has been around since the 14th century, but now it's frankly a rather tacky fun fair that nevertheless dominates the central streets of Pinner on the Whit Wednesday, which is one of those things that if you grow up in Pinner, you learn about. Pinner's real claim to fame is its string of 16th century buildings. The Queen's Head pub, very near the church, also on the High Street, is one of the more distinguished of its type. The former Victory pub the beginning of the high street, is also a 16th century building. It's now a restaurant. And dotted around the village are little cottages from that period. In fact, if you know where to look, you can find a 15th century house just off Moss Lane. And they're pretty rare in London. Beyond that, Pinner is dominated by the River Pin, which goes on for quite a while, and in 1987 burst its banks very spectacularly, causing absolute chaos. Pinner's always been a bit snobbish, though. It has one of the lowest crime rates in London. I don't know if I didn't contribute to that, but there we go. But it represents old suburbia, the old villages eaten up by the Metropolitan line. The next two stops, Northwood Hills and Northwood. Well, Northwood is a bit the same. It has quite a long history, if a rather featureless one. Northwood backs on to Ruislip, which is in the Domesday Book, and therefore definitely goes back to the 11th century. And now we reach out towards the edges of London. The border between London, Greater London, and Hertfordshire happens just as the train arrives at Moor Park. And you see, as you land there, a huge golf course of some international distinction. But we're now leaving London. My mother was evacuated to Amersham, which is probably the end of the real Metropolitan line nowadays. And so she was very familiar and very fond of the area to the north of Moor Park. And I remember being taken for picnics and other activities in Chorley Wood, where there's some lovely greenery. But you know what? Once we go past Moor Park, things are not quite the same. Having said that, whoever designed Metroland set a lovely trap for the unwary by putting the end of one of the branch lines at Watford, except Watford Station is nowhere near the town centre of Watford. If you want to go and find the football club, and the Watford High Street is your station. Watford Junction isn't very far away either from Vicarage Road, where Elton John's favourite club plays. Elton John, of course, is a child of Metroland. He was brought up in Pinner, as were many other celebrities. It's a bit of a celebrity spot neighbourhood. But Metroland itself, it's a series of villages and made-up neighbourhoods glued together by a railway line. Attractive for people who wanted to commute into London, but also of appeal to people who like the idea of living in a bit of old England. And it's that strange mixture of the ancient and the modern, all looped up together, that is Metroland. Thank you.